Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Allegations that Hungarian intelligence agents spied on EU institutions have rattled Brussels, surfacing just as Budapest continues to block Ukraine's EU accession talks. The revelations risk further eroding trust between Hungary and its European partners at a critical time for EU unity. Joining us is Professor Scott Lucas from University College Dublin and a regular contributor. Professor, welcome back to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me here.
Okay, so let's start with the espionage revelations, although I must point out they are only allegations at the moment. What's going on there?
So the allegations, as you put them, they go back several years. I think around the period from 2015 on to around 2017, 2018, but they're quite serious allegations based on months of investigations, of documents, and of testimony that's been gathered by several European outlets, including Belgian and German newspapers, and that Hungary had a coordinated effort, including through its envoys in Brussels, to carry out spying activities. And these spying activities included the attempts to gather information from the European Commission and to turn staff of the European Commission into spies, into active agents. There is one particular detailed allegation, which is that there was a Hungarian staff member of the Commission who had several meetings with a purported diplomat from the Hungarian embassy. In fact, a diplomat a spy under diplomatic cover, who kept saying to him, "What kind of information are you getting from the Commission? What can you tell me?" And then finally said, "Here's a contract. We'd like you to sign this contract to become a secret agent working for the Hungarian intelligence service."
Yeah, but one thing I don't understand, Scott, is this. Hungary already has a presence at the European Union in its various bodies. Why does it need to spy? Surely it has access to that information already, doesn't it?
Well, I think you'll know that in a body like the European Commission, with its multiple offices, its multiple agencies, that there will be classifications of information. There will be some extremely sensitive information that would not necessarily be released to national delegations. And although I can't confirm this, I haven't seen the documents in question, but I'd say from studying intelligence services, from understanding how these processes work, Hungary was trying to get access to that documentation and to those deliberations of the Commission that were beyond national level.
Okay, why is then the next question? Why would they do that? What's the big picture here? What's the game?
Well, I think there's a couple of big pictures here. One is that there's a big picture which is coming out through the documentation, which is that Hungary's intelligence services, a little bit of that legacy from before 1991, the old Soviet Union days, the Soviet sphere, that some of the techniques are the old Soviet techniques, that you cultivate this whole group of people who are within various bodies, to the extent that the Hungarian services were using language that's resonant of the Soviet language. That you had, for example, what they would call domestic assets. Now, these are assets who would give you verbal information, and then you would have secret assets. These were assets that would give you actual documents. And I think that tradition, that intelligence gathering tradition, persists in Hungarian agencies. And then I think there's something which is more specific to the Hungary of the past decade, and that is the Hungary of Viktor Orbán, who is still prime minister there. And that is that this is a country which is within the EU, but which has been at odds with the EU. It has been at odds with the EU over its domestic practices, over its curbing of rights, over its attacks on its own judicial system at certain points, over its approach to certain communities such as the LGBT community. This is also a Hungary which has been at odds with the EU over its external policy, We've seen that, for example, in recent years with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so Hungary, with this 1 foot in, 1 foot out approach to the EU, has this dual position of being both a member and someone who is skeptical of the Commission. And I think that skepticism, some would call that concern, some might even call it paranoia, that led them to expand these operations. Because here's one thing I've also learned from studying intelligence operations of multiple countries across the world. It is far easier to expand intelligence operations than it is to shut them down.
Understood. Now, talking about the relationship between Hungary and the European Union, one of the bones of contention that they have is allowing Ukraine accession into the European Union, if, of course, Ukraine meets the criteria that have already been specified. Now, there is little, it seems, reason for Hungary to be the only one disagreeing with Ukrainian accession. However, President Zelensky, I think we have a soundbite of his coming up. President Zelensky believes that Ukraine will get into the EU with or without Hungary. Do we have that soundbite? I think it might be.
Ukraine will be in the European Union with or without Orbán, because this is the choice of the people of Ukraine. I'm sure that Hungary, the Hungarian people, support Ukraine in any case. I'm sure of this.
I mean, he's talking about Ukraine entering the EU without Hungary's participation in the process. Is he being realistic? Is there a workaround Hungary's recalcitrance?
Well, I think it's a bit of PR by Vladimir Zelensky, and I support that PR. I mean, you play up the idea of Ukraine getting into the EU because that is Ukraine's future. But to be realistic here, first of all, we have to say that beyond the specific obstruction of Hungary, there are issues that have to be dealt with. This is not an easy path for Ukraine to getting into the EU. And I'm sure that your viewers will know that you've got to talk about issues in terms of anti-corruption, that you have rigorous systems for that. You need to have further judicial reform in Ukraine. You need to have benchmarks regarding governance. You need to have economic benchmarks that are set. That's what we're in the process of doing. I think your viewers will also know, by the way, that it's not just Hungary that is an obstacle here. You could look at Slovakia with another Putin ally, Robert Fico, as the prime minister. But look, Hungary is the loudest opponent of Ukraine getting into the EU, and Viktor Orbán is one of the loudest backers at points of the Kremlin's line. That's just the way that it plays out. And we have a fundamental here, which will have to be addressed, which is that the EU quite often relies on unanimous support of its members to make steps, to make moves. And as long as you have that requirement for unanimity, Hungary has leverage, which it can continue to exert. Now, so far, on key issues, such as ongoing economic aid to Ukraine, such as, to an extent, sanctions on Russia, the EU has been able to overcome Orbán. He has backed down. But I don't think you can count on Orbán backing down in the near future over the vital question of Ukraine's accession. So we're going to have this contest of words as well as maneuvers behind the scenes going on for some time to come.
Indeed, maneuvers is the right word, I think. But is there a possibility that the constitution of the EU might be edited to allow decisions like this to be made without unanimous consent?
Certainly there are European officials who are going to outlets in recent weeks that are talking about decisions might be made by qualified majority rather than by unanimity. But I think that's going to be a process that's going to take some time because, look, even, there's a saying back from my native country, which is that hard cases make bad law. And that some countries will say, look, we can understand why you want to go with qualified majority because of Hungary's obstruction regarding Ukraine. But if you do that, you open this up for qualified majority across a whole range of cases. And you will have individual states who will object to that and say, look, no, we don't want qualified majority because smaller states might get bullied at certain points by other states. So I think this is it's frustrating. because you want to see that Ukraine path to the EU be a relatively smooth one. You want that, by the way, for Moldova as well, a country which deserves support as Russia tries to destabilize it. But the EU has always been on the principle that it tries to heed the views of all of its members, not just some of them. And Orbán will continue to play upon that for as long as he can.
How long do you think he'll be in power? He's got elections coming up. Do you think he'll hang on to his position?
That's a really, really interesting question, because the surface question here is that you've got the party of Tisza under Peter Magyar, which is making inroads in Hungary, especially in the urban areas. And despite the fact that Viktor Orbán stacks the deck when it comes to the electoral system, he can't go completely authoritarian. And so you're seeing in various local elections, you're seeing in terms of polling, that Tisza is making influence. I would also say, from a wonderful young journalist named Blair Brandt, who's just written for me, that the opposition parties, including Magyar's party, and their use of digital media is far more effective than Orbán and his party at this point. That being said, I think you've got to be realistic, which is Orbán, who really is a throwback to the pre-1991 leaders that we were used to in Central and Eastern Europe. He'll try to cling to power by any means necessary. So I think, again, we're going to see a change in the Hungarian political scene, the domestic scene. It will be significant, but it's not going to be an overnight change that is going to remove Orbán from power.
Do you think Orbán is going to tone down some of his rhetoric as he gets closer to the election?
I think Orbán plays to different parts of Hungary. I mean, look, Orbán he's a very skillful tactician, at least in the old sense of politics. He's going to play to his rural communities. He's going to play to a sense that it's the elites who continue to manipulate them, even though he is a member of the elite. He's going to play to the populism that Donald Trump has marketed in the United States. And he's going to play to that idea that he's the only guy that can maintain order in Hungary. And look at Ukraine. We don't want to be like Ukraine with all this disorder. We don't want to be like a country further afield like Georgia with all its disorder. So you've got to continue to rely on me. Don't underestimate the fact that he does have widespread support, even if we have free and fair elections.
Yeah.
And so there's a long road to hoe here.
There is, and we shall be watching eagerly. Professor Scott Lucas, as always, thank you very much for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good evening.
Thanks to you and your great viewers.
Thank you. Bye-bye. That brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. As always, lots more coming up. Goodbye.